welcome to the financial planning update for March 2022. Lots to discuss, of course, in the month of March, so we will get straight to it with our usual look at some of the main market indices. And we have a really interesting story here in two respects, actually. The first of which is, as has been the trend really since the beginning of the year, it's pleasing to see the FTSE outperforming the majority of other global markets. And this is perhaps a reflection of the FTSE's slightly more defensive nature as a market, especially compared to the US market, which of course now consists primarily of the US technology giants, or at least they certainly have a very big influence over the market. So the FTSE 100 is coming into its own in 2022 and substantially outperforming the other major indices, most notably the US, but also most of the other global indices as well. So Team UK seems to be outperforming the rest of the world at the moment, which can only be a good thing for UK investors, and is a very nice change in fortune for the UK market, which has been somewhat unloved for quite a period of time now. The other really interesting fact here is that we see the world index now underperforming the S&P. Now, historically, the world index has often sat somewhere between the FTSE and the S&P, sort of, almost representing an average between the US and the UK markets, which are two of the largest markets in the world in terms of their overall market capitalization. So what this suggests is that actually it's other markets, and primarily the European and of course the Russian markets, that are causing the drag on performance in the global index. So again, another very interesting turn of events, and something which we will of course keep an eye on in coming months. But the general trend you will notice here in all of the major markets, really since the beginning of March, is one of recovery. Now, as usual, the recovery tends to be somewhat slower than the drop. Market falls are often quite short and sharp, and the recovery is somewhat more slow and steady. And once again, that's what we're seeing here. In terms of the portfolio performance, we see again a similar picture of recovery here from the beginning of March, really. We saw a bit of a drop-off towards the end of the first week in March, but since then we do see that trend of recovery now developing. Now that the portfolios are perhaps not performing quite in line with the global market indices, and of course this is because most of the portfolios contain some element of bonds, and those will be corporate or government bonds. Now those assets have also not had the best time recently, given that we've started to see interest rates increasing across the globe, and that process has happened perhaps somewhat faster than anticipated. Now that the portfolios were all positioned fairly defensively in that respect anyway, but of course they did contain an element of corporate and government bonds, and those have suffered as interest rates have started to increase. Although once again there is some good news on that front, because the prospect for interest rate increases is perhaps now softening slightly, given events in Ukraine and the additional pressures that's going to have on the global economy and on supply chains. So there could be some further good news to come for bonds in the next few months or weeks. And we see again gentle trend of recovery with the portfolios. They've all taken their rightful place. If you look back a couple of weeks on this chart, if you look back to the week of the 9th of March, you can see highlighted here. You'll notice the cautious portfolio at that point was effectively leading the pack. It would have been the best performer year to date at that point in time. And of course, that's exactly what you would expect in a falling market, that the more conservative portfolio will protect the downside and outperform to a certain extent. Just after the week of the 17th of March, you'll notice that position reverses itself, and that the portfolios take their rightful place, if you like, with the adventurous portfolio delivering the better performance. Now, we've also seen a slightly greater divergence than usual between the active and the passive portfolios in the last few months. And this is primarily down to how the active managers have handled the Ukraine crisis. These things are notoriously difficult to trade around. And of course, we saw some very substantial volatility during the early days of the war in Ukraine unfolding. So very interesting divergence here between the active and the passive portfolios. Nothing to get particularly concerned about at the moment, and indeed the recovery has been ever so slightly faster on the active portfolio, so that the gap is closing once again, but definitely something it will be interesting to keep an eye on in the next few months as well. Now, the other big news in the last few days, of course, has been the spring statement. I've highlighted here what I believe to be the three most prominent announcements from a personal finance perspective. And as I commented in my blog the other day, these announcements are really surprising, really shocking in two respects, really. The first of which is how significant they are. As I mentioned in my article the other day, only a few months ago, a 5p reduction in fuel duty would have seemed spectacularly generous. You know, it's very unusual to see these kinds of reductions to fuel duty. The duty has been frozen now for well over a decade, but it's very unusual to see these things reduced, and especially by 5p. You know, you may occasionally see a token gesture 1p reduction to fuel duty, but to find a 5p reduction is really quite unusual. So it's incredibly unusual in how far the Chancellor has gone. The same is true about the national insurance threshold as well. We now see the national insurance threshold aligned with the income tax personal allowance, the tax-free allowance of just over £12,500. Now, that had been announced previously, and it was expected to sort of unfold during the rest of this Parliament, but of course the Chancellor has now chosen to accelerate that process and align the two, the tax and the national insurance thresholds. Now, I've always thought this is very much common sense. It makes sense that both of the taxes effectively kick in at the same point. And you know, now that the allowances and the thresholds have been aligned, you know, one might argue that it does open the door perhaps to combine income tax and national insurance. It will be interesting to see if that gains any further traction in the next couple of years. Now, the final announcement, and again, you know, this is quite significant, but the timing is perhaps not quite as generous as on the other two measures. So the Chancellor has announced that we will be seeing a reduction in the main headline rate of tax, the basic rate tax band, from 20% down to 19%. However, that's not due to take effect until April 2024, so we've effectively got 2 years to wait for that one. Being slightly cynical, I think that was designed to grab the headlines and perhaps divert attention away from other matters, even though we've got to wait 2 years for the reduction to take effect. Now, of course, again, being slightly cynical, the 1% reduction in income tax only goes part of the way to unravelling the 1.25% increase we see in national insurance, which of course will take effect in just a week or so's time in the new tax year. So, of course, any reduction to tax is always going to be welcome, but it's only going part of the way to reversing a tax increase. And again, being slightly cynical about things, we have to face the tax increase right now, whereas this reduction is only going to take effect in 2 years' time. So I mentioned there was two reasons these announcements were very surprising, the first of which is the scope and the scale of the announcements. But the second reason they're so surprising is just how futile and how insignificant they seem in the face of rising prices. As I've mentioned, a 5% reduction in fuel duty under normal circumstances would seem incredibly generous. But we've just seen roughly a 50p increase in the price of fuel in the last year or two. So again, in comparison, it's only a 10% reduction to the total cost increase we've seen in the last year or so. Again, the national insurance threshold, of course, this is welcome, but it's not going to go a great way to covering the increased energy bills that we're seeing. Of course, we've just gone through review meetings with many of our clients, and it's been really interesting to note the increased energy expenses that people are noting down. And on average, I would say that those costs are doubling. So somebody historically who was paying £150 a month for utilities is now maybe paying £300 per month. I've spoken to a couple of clients who use heating oil rather than gas. their prices have gone up by 2 or 3 times in some cases versus what they were paying only a year or so ago. So very, very substantial cost increases, and of course it does make these allowances, while welcome, look slightly less generous when we compare them to the increase in expenditure that some of us are facing. So these are all issues which, of course, we'll keep a close eye on in the coming months. It will be very interesting to see how the gas and the natural natural resources prices settle in the coming months. And of course, something which no doubt we'll be having conversations with clients about as we go through the remainder of our review meetings in the next month or so as well. So that's everything we have for you today. As always, if you do require any assistance with your financial planning, please don't hesitate to contact a member of the Buckingham Gate team.